Racist police officer, with a firm grip, yanks a black father by the arm, pulling him away from the school entrance. The father, confused and shocked, tries to explain, but the officer's expression remains cold, his actions deliberate. "You're coming with me," the officer says, ignoring the father's protests. The father, feeling the weight of the officer's authority, stands frozen for a moment before he starts to question, "What's going on? Why are you arresting me?" The officer doesn't answer. The father's attempts to reason are met with silence as the officer pulls harder, taking him toward the waiting squad car. Then, a young voice cuts through the tension. "Don't touch my dad!" she shouts, her words slicing through the thick silence. All eyes turn to her. The officer freezes, taken aback by the strength in her voice. The father, still caught in the officer's hold, looks up at his daughter. Her next words? They would change everything. A black father, calmly walking towards his daughter's school to pick her up, suddenly finds himself surrounded by a police officer who demands that he stop. Confused, he tries to explain he's just here to pick up his child. But the officer isn't interested in his explanation. Without warning, the officer grabs his arm, pulling him toward a squad car. The father, startled, tries to pull away, asking why he's being arrested. But the officer refuses to answer and insists, "You need to come with me now." Just when the situation seems to be spiraling out of control, a voice cuts through the tension. A voice no one expected. The father's daughter, just a few feet away, has been watching the entire scene unfold. She runs toward her father, her small body shaking with fear and anger. "Don't touch my dad!" she yells, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. The officer hesitates for a moment, as the little girl's words stun everyone in earshot. But it's not just the officer who is shaken. The entire scene freezes as the father, his daughter, and the watching crowd realize that something is about to change. What happens next? Will the father be freed, or is this the start of something bigger? As the officer tightens his grip on the father's arm, the little girl's eyes grow wide. She's trembling, but she doesn't back down. Her heart races, but she knows she has to do something. "Stop! You can't do this to my dad!" she yells again, her voice breaking through the tension. Her small frame stands firm between her father and the officer, as if she's trying to protect him. The officer looks down at her, his face unreadable. He's never had anyone challenge his authority like this before, especially not a child. He pauses for a split second, caught off guard by her courage. But before he can respond, the little girl speaks again, this time more calmly but with even more determination in her voice. "You can't arrest him. He's my dad. He didn't do anything wrong," she says, her words slicing through the air like a sharp blade. The crowd of parents and teachers who had been watching the situation unfold are now silent. Eyes flick back and forth between the officer and the girl. What's going to happen next? No one knows, but everyone feels the weight of the moment. The officer, still holding on to the father, turns toward the little girl with a look of confusion and anger. "This is none of your business," he snaps. His words are harsh, but the girl stands her ground, her small hands balled into fists at her sides. "I'm not scared of you," she says firmly. "My dad didn't do anything wrong, and you can't just take him away because of the color of his skin." A murmur runs through the crowd. The officer's face starts to turn red. He's used to people backing down, to people being afraid when he pulls out his badge. But this girl, this little girl, she's challenging him in a way he's never been challenged before. He starts to speak again, but the father, still in shock, pulls away from the officer's grip and steps closer to his daughter. "Stop. Just stop," he says softly. His voice is calm, but his eyes show the confusion and fear that have been building in him. The officer stares at the father, his anger growing, but then he turns back to the crowd. The silence that hangs in the air is unbearable. The tension is thick, But the little girl's voice cuts through the room one last time. You have no right to hurt him. You're supposed to protect us, not make us afraid. And in that moment, something shifts. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, starts to speak up. Parents nod, a few shake their heads in disbelief at what they've just witnessed. The officer, now standing still, realizes he's lost control of the situation. Then, someone from the crowd steps forward. A teacher, who has been watching quietly from a distance, speaks up. "This is enough," she says, her voice steady. "You can't arrest him without a reason. You need to leave, now." The officer hesitates, looking around at the increasing number of people standing with the girl and her father. Realizing he's outnumbered, he backs down, his face red with humiliation. He doesn't say another word but slowly turns and walks away, leaving the father and daughter standing in the middle of the crowd. The father looks at his daughter with a mix of pride and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispers. "You were so brave." The little girl smiles up at him, her eyes still wide, but now filled with relief. She wraps her arms around him, and for a moment it feels like everything might be okay. But the scene isn't over. The crowd, still in shock, begins to murmur and nod in agreement. The teacher who stepped forward steps closer to the father and daughter. "This isn't just about one officer," she says. "It's about all of us. We have to make sure something like this never happens again." And in that moment, a new sense of unity begins to form. The school, the community, and even the officer himself have witnessed the power of a young girl's voice. It's a reminder that no one, no matter their age, should ever be afraid to stand up for what's right. The officer, furious at being questioned, steps even closer to the black father. His grip on the father's wrist tightens, his tone growing more forceful. "I don't want to hear another word from you," the officer snaps, his voice cold and harsh. The father, though in shock, tries to remain calm, his face flushed with confusion and anger. "What is this about? Why are you arresting me?" Before the officer can answer, a crowd begins to gather around, curious and concerned, watching the tense standoff. The father looks around, hoping for some form of support, but all he sees are strangers, some looking worried, others unsure of what to do. Then, the officer speaks again, his words dripping with authority and disdain. "You're disturbing the peace, and I'm arresting you for being a troublemaker." The father, still confused, shakes his head. "I haven't done anything wrong. I just came here to pick up my daughter." As the officer attempts to pull him towards the squad car, the father's daughter, a young girl no more than 8 years old, steps forward, her small frame holding a determined air. She walks up to the officer, her hands on her hips, her eyes fiercely fixed on him. "You can't arrest my daddy!" she shouts, her voice loud and full of conviction. The officer stares at her for a moment, taken aback. No one had ever dared speak to him like this before. His eyes narrow as he tries to dismiss her, but the girl is relentless. "He's done nothing wrong. He's not a criminal. You can't just take him because he's black," she declares, causing the crowd around them to murmur in disbelief. Her words, innocent yet piercing, strike a chord with everyone present. The officer pauses, his expression shifting slightly. The girl's words hang in the air, heavy with truth, but the officer, stubborn and unmoved by the child's bravery, refuses to relent. "You don't know what you're talking about. Go back inside, little girl. This is between your father and me." But the father, looking at his daughter, realizes she's his only ally in this moment. She's not scared of the officer. She's standing up for him. And for a second, he feels a sense of strength rising in him. He turns to the officer and says, "You're wrong. You have no reason to arrest me." The little girl doesn't back down. "You can't hurt him," she says, her voice unwavering. "He's a good man, and you're not going to take him away." Her words echo in the quiet space between them. causing the crowd to grow more uncomfortable with the officer's actions. The officer, now visibly flustered, takes a step back, trying to regain control. His hand still grips the father's arm, but the tension in the air is thick. The crowd watches, unsure of how this will end. It's then that another voice joins the fray. One of the teachers, a middle-aged woman, steps forward from the crowd. She speaks with a calm authority, addressing the officer directly. "You can't arrest him for no reason. This needs to stop right now." The officer, clearly taken aback by the sudden pushback, glares at the teacher, but she stands her ground, her voice firm. "We're watching you. We won't let you treat him like this. We won't let you hurt this family." The tension builds, and the officer, realizing the situation is spiraling out of his control, looks around. He can feel the eyes of the crowd on him. The once confident stance he had is now faltering, and he knows that his actions are drawing attention he doesn't want. The father, taking a deep breath, looks at the officer one last time. "This needs to stop," he says, his voice calm but resolute. The officer's face reddens as he begins to retreat, his grip on the father loosening. He turns toward his squad car, still holding a tight fist of anger, but he knows he has no choice but to back down. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, begins to cheer. Some clap, others shout words of support for the family, and the little girl, standing tall with pride beside her father, looks up at him with a smile that's filled with triumph. The officer, humiliated and defeated, walks away, his head lowered. The father, shaken but relieved, kneels down to his daughter. "Thank you, baby," he says, his voice filled with gratitude and admiration. She looks up at him, smiling. "I'll always protect you, Daddy," she replies softly. The teacher, who had spoken up earlier, now walks over to the family, offering a warm smile. "You did the right thing. You've made us all proud," she says. And for the first time in a long while, the father feels like they might just be able to overcome the injustice they face every day. The scene fades out with the father and daughter standing together, their bond strengthened by this moment of defiance and courage. The community, now more united than ever, begins to discuss what they can do to ensure that incidents like this never happen again. As the officer turns away, his face reddening with frustration, the crowd around him starts to murmur. Their eyes, once uncertain, are now fixed on him, silently judging his actions. The tension in the air grows thick. The father stands tall beside his daughter, still holding on to his calm, though the adrenaline is rushing through him. His daughter, standing next to him, still holding the officer's gaze, speaks up. "You have no right to treat my dad this way," she says, her voice carrying through the quiet space like a powerful command. "He didn't do anything wrong. He's just a good man, and you're wrong to treat him like this." The officer falters, taken aback by the raw honesty and strength in her words. He's used to bullying people into submission, used to having the upper hand. But now, in front of the growing crowd, he feels the power slipping from his hands. His face twitches with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Step back, little girl," he snaps, trying to regain control of the situation. "This doesn't concern you." But the little girl, without hesitation, steps even closer to him, her hands clenched at her sides. "It does concern me. You're hurting my dad, and I won't let you do that." The officer looks around, realizing the crowd has grown, and people are now recording the whole incident on their phones. Some people, who had been hesitant earlier, are now clearly showing signs of frustration and support for the family. Others are beginning to step forward, echoing the sentiments of the little girl, saying things like, "This isn't right," and "Stop bullying him." The father looks down at his daughter, feeling a swell of pride. Her bravery, her ability to stand up against such injustice, fills him with strength. It's clear now that he isn't just fighting for himself. He's fighting for his daughter's right to feel safe and for all of them to be treated with respect. "Why don't you just leave?" the officer demands again, clearly rattled. But the crowd, the very presence of so many people standing together, begins to close in. He realizes he's losing his grip on the situation. Then, a voice from the crowd calls out, "What do you think you're doing? This man hasn't done anything wrong. He's just here to pick up his daughter. You're making a fool of yourself." The officer's eyes widen in realization. The words are loud, clear, and the pressure is mounting. He's now not just facing the family, but a whole group of people who have witnessed the wrong in front of them. Slowly, more voices rise in support of the family. Some continue to film, while others speak out, urging the officer to stop. "Let him go," one woman demands. "You've already done enough." The officer, still standing, has no response. He looks at the father, who remains calm but firm, and then at the daughter, who stands tall beside him. Her small but confident stance shows him that this is a fight he cannot win. The officer realizes that every move he makes, every word he speaks, is only worsening the situation. The tension continues to build. The officer's once confident stance begins to waver as he realizes the severity of what he's done. His initial anger and attempt to control the situation have only made things worse. He can feel the weight of the community's gaze upon him. The crowd's disapproval is now undeniable. And then, as if on cue, the school's principal, hearing the commotion, steps out. She walks over to the officer, her expression serious. She speaks in a calm but authoritative voice. "What's going on here?" she asks, her eyes briefly scanning the scene before resting on the officer. The officer's frustration flares again, but he knows better than to argue with the principal. "This man was disturbing the peace," he says, his voice trailing off as if he's trying to justify his actions. "I was just doing my job." The officer's eyes widen in realization. The words are loud, clear, and the pressure is mounting. He's now not just facing the family, but a whole group of people who have witnessed the wrong in front of them. Slowly, more voices rise in support of the family. Some continue to film, while others speak out, urging the officer to stop. "Let him go," one woman demands. "You've already done enough." The officer, still standing, has no response. He looks at the father, who remains calm but firm, and then at the daughter, who stands tall beside him. Her small but confident stance shows him that this is a fight he cannot win. The officer realizes that every move he makes, every word he speaks, is only worsening the situation. The tension continues to build. The officer's once confident stance begins to waver as he realizes the severity of what he's done. His initial anger and attempt to control the situation have only made things worse. He can feel the weight of the community's gaze upon him. The crowd's disapproval is now undeniable. And then, as if on cue, the school's principal, hearing the commotion, steps out. She walks over to the officer, her expression serious. She speaks in a calm but authoritative voice. "What's going on here?" she asks, her eyes briefly scanning the scene before resting on the officer. The officer's frustration flares again, but he knows better than to argue with the principal. "This man was disturbing the peace," he says, his voice trailing off as if he's trying to justify his actions. "I was just doing my job." The principal turns to the father. "Is that true?" she asks gently. The father looks at her and then shakes his head. "I haven't done anything wrong. I just came to pick up my daughter." The principal nods, understanding the situation at once. She looks back at the officer. "You're dismissed, officer," she says firmly. "This needs to be resolved immediately." The officer, now realizing he has no support, no backup, and no justification for his actions, stands there frozen. His face is a mixture of embarrassment and shame. He slowly turns and walks away, his head lowered, knowing that he's been defeated by the truth and by the courage of a young girl. The crowd watches, silent but relieved, as the officer retreats. The father, with his daughter beside him, finally breathes a sigh of relief. They're free. They're safe. The injustice they faced is over, for now. The principal, now addressing the father and daughter, says, "I'm sorry for what you had to go through. This isn't what we stand for. You both have my full support." The father nods, looking at his daughter with pride. "Thank you," he says. "I'm glad she was there to speak out." The young girl looks up at him and smiles, her voice calm but full of pride. "I wasn't going to let them hurt you, Daddy. I'll always protect you." The scene closes with the father and daughter walking away together, their bond stronger than ever. They have stood up against injustice, and in the process they've inspired others to do the same. The officer stands, gripping the father's arm, but something shifts. A quiet voice from the crowd interrupts. "Why are you doing this?" The officer doesn't answer, but the question hangs in the air. More voices follow. "Let him go!" The tension thickens, and the crowd, once silent, is now murmuring in disbelief. The father stands firm, his daughter by his side. With a steady hand, she grips her father's arm and speaks up. "Stop hurting him. He hasn't done anything wrong." Her voice cuts through the chaos, and for the first time, the officer hesitates. The crowd goes quiet. The officer falters, caught in the truth of her words. His grip loosens, and his eyes dart around, unsure of what to do. He's used to power, but in this moment, it's slipping away. "You don't have to do this," the daughter continues. "People are watching. What will you do when they see the truth?" The officer doesn't have an answer. The father and daughter stand together, their unity speaking louder than any words. The crowd, now emboldened, begins to speak out, echoing the daughter's call for justice. The officer, realizing his mistake, steps back. The crowd murmurs in approval, their support solidifying the family's stand against injustice. The father, calm but resolute, says, "We just want to go home." He leads his daughter away from the officer, who, defeated, retreats. As they walk away, the daughter looks up at her father, smiling. "You're not the only one who fights for what's right," she says. The lesson is clear. Courage, when combined with truth and support, can overcome even the most unjust of situations. The incident has already made waves. Word of what happened spreads like wildfire, but it isn't just the father and daughter's words that are being shared. It's the truth. The footage, captured by onlookers, is everywhere. Social media platforms are buzzing. News outlets begin covering it, framing it not just as an isolated event, but as a glaring example of the larger issues of racial injustice. The community rallies behind the family. They post support messages, creating hashtags to raise awareness. Comments flood in from all corners of the world, offering condolences, but also praises for the bravery of the father, and especially his daughter. But, as with any viral event, there are voices who try to undermine what happened. They argue that the officer was just doing his job, and they point fingers at the daughter's actions as disrespectful. They claim she shouldn't have intervened, that she should have been quiet and let the system handle it. But the support keeps coming. Protests begin to form outside police stations and local government buildings. People in the community gather, demanding answers. They're not just asking for the officer's actions to be reviewed, they're asking for a change. And then the officer is put on paid leave. It's a step, but it's not enough. The community wants accountability. They want more than just a temporary suspension. They want reform. For the father, it's bittersweet. He's grateful for the public's support, but his heart aches as he thinks about how the system has failed people like him for so long. His daughter's bravery has opened a door, but now he knows the battle is just beginning. Meanwhile, the daughter's school holds a meeting. Students are divided. Some praise her courage, while others feel conflicted. Was she wrong to challenge authority? Could things have gone differently? The principal, seeing the division, holds a town hall meeting to address the issue. It's clear that the conversation is uncomfortable for some. The truth is hard to face, especially when the facts are staring everyone in the face. The daughter stands in front of the assembly, her words calm but powerful. "I didn't want to cause trouble. I just wanted my father to be treated fairly. People should be treated with respect no matter what. We all deserve it." The room is silent for a moment. Her peers, some who had previously been hesitant, now understand. They see that this isn't just about one moment, one incident. It's about all the moments that have come before it. The story isn't just a local issue anymore. It's a conversation that spans across the country, perhaps even the world. People are demanding change, not just for this one officer, but for the system itself. As the backlash continues, the family is contacted by several advocacy groups who want to work with them to push for policy changes. Their story has sparked a fire, and they are now at the forefront of a movement they never asked for, but now have no choice but to embrace. For the father and daughter, this is just the beginning. They know that the road ahead will be long, but with every message of support, every march, every conversation, they feel hope. After the initial wave of outrage, something remarkable begins to unfold. The officer involved in the incident, who has been on paid leave, finally speaks out publicly. His statement is carefully crafted, acknowledging that his actions were wrong. He admits to the mistakes he made, but he also emphasizes that he has learned from the situation. For many, this is a difficult moment. Some argue that an apology isn't enough, that words alone cannot undo the damage caused. They're right to be skeptical. However, there's a genuine sense that the officer's reflection on his actions isn't just lip service. He agrees to undergo sensitivity and anti-racism training. He expresses remorse not just for the incident, but for the harm caused to the community. His message is clear. He recognizes his privilege and vows to do better. Meanwhile, the family, still processing everything, decides to meet with the officer. It's a tense meeting, one filled with emotion. The father speaks first, saying he doesn't want to hear excuses. He wants to know how the officer plans to change, how he plans to make sure no other father ever has to go through the same thing. The officer listens quietly. His eyes are filled with regret, but he doesn't interrupt. He knows the gravity of the moment, and he knows that his redemption will only come through meaningful actions. The meeting ends with an agreement. The officer will speak at community events, sharing his journey of self-reflection. He will also work with the family to push for changes in how officers are trained and how they interact with the community. For the family, this meeting isn't about forgiveness. It's not about forgetting what happened, but it's a step toward something better. It's a step toward building a system that works for everyone, not just for the powerful. The daughter, watching the meeting from the sidelines, doesn't speak much, but her presence is felt. She's learned that even in the face of adversity, there's power in standing up for what's right. She's learned that change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with a single voice. And sometimes, that voice is loud enough to change the world. Back in the school, the students, inspired by her courage, begin organizing their own initiatives. They start talking about issues they've never discussed before: racial equality, police reform, and community responsibility. The conversation spreads beyond the walls of the school and into the community, gaining traction with each passing day. The father and daughter have ignited a spark, but now it's the community's turn to keep it alive. They begin hosting forums, inviting local leaders, law enforcement, and residents to come together and talk openly about the changes they want to see. These forums turn into regular gatherings where people can share their thoughts, frustrations, and ideas for a better future. For the officer, redemption is a long road. He knows that the apology and the training aren't enough to change everything, but he's committed to the work ahead. The road to redemption isn't easy, but the officer is determined to walk it. And for the family, This is just one chapter in a larger story. They've been through the storm, but they now see the light ahead. They know that it won't be easy, but with each step they take, the path to a fairer and more just world becomes clearer. As the story closes, we see the father and daughter standing together at one of the community forums. They look out at the people gathered around them, some of whom are still uncertain, some of whom are skeptical, but they all share one thing: a willingness to listen, to learn, and to change. It's a small step, but it's a step forward. The family's journey continues, not just as victims of an unjust system, but as beacons of hope. They've shown that no matter how difficult the fight, change is possible. It begins with one voice, but it ends with a united community that stands for what is right.